Well, hello everyone. Welcome to this is the 364th meeting of the New York Comics and Picture Story Symposium. This is a weekly lecture series, discussion series that features people who make comics, people who talk about comics, people who think about comics in some kind of ways. It was founded about over a decade ago by one of our guests tonight, coincidentally, Ben Katchor. And this is a weekly series where people talk about comics, discuss comics. It was founded over a decade ago by Ben Katchor. And this is the first meeting of this calendar, the fall 2023 calendar year. Just some housekeeping at the beginning. I'm putting in the chat now a link to our schedule for this season. And my name's Austin English. I've been co-curating the symposium with Ben these last 2 semesters. And this season is co-curated by Ben, myself, Bill Cardilopoulos, and Lily Correa. And I think I'm very excited about this season because if you look at the people on there, there's people involved in comics that I'm only vaguely aware of. So even all you out there who are immersed in what the symposium does, that know everything about comics, there's definitely going to be people in this season that will be unfamiliar to you that I think will be very exciting for you to spend some time with their talk. And so one of the ideas to me that's very appealing about the symposium is that it's supposed to be free form. The people that participate in it, the people that are asked, while they can talk about a new book, maybe there's a new book that they want to promote. We definitely have people in this calendar year that are going to do that. We are, of course, open to that and excited about that. If there's, I believe Bill Griffith will be talking about his new book in this calendar year. If someone just wants to give an overview of what they do artistically, that's also something that we, of course, welcome. But my favorite iterations of the symposium are when people just talk about an idea. People talk about something that's maybe not even topical, but an idea that relates to comics in some way that they want to speak about. And when we asked Gary Groth to participate in some way in this calendar year, I think he really had a great idea for the symposium. And Gary is someone that we really wanted to bring in to the symposium. He is, for those that don't know, Gary is the co-founder of Fantagraphics Books, and he is the managing editor of the Comics Journal. And Fantagraphics, I believe, and I think many others would agree with this, is the most consequential publisher of comics as a sophisticated adult art form in North America. One of them, if not the most consequential, and one that has fought, I think fought is a good word to use, fought for a certain ideal of what comics can be, and what they might be with proper attention to the past and proper attention to the future. And so we definitely wanted to bring Gary into this to discuss things. And when we asked Gary, he did have one of those ideas for the symposium that was about an idea. Gary wanted to bring Ben, our symposium founder, into the conversation to talk about a really interesting idea. And Ben, for those of maybe there's some of you out there that only know Ben as the Ben is someone who, if Fantagraphics and the Comics Journal have a certain idea that they're advocating for about what comics can be and a certain standard of the art form of cartooning, I think Ben as an artist is a great fulfillment of that idea, of someone who has dedicated themselves to a very sophisticated expression of comics and what they can be artistically. Ben is probably most well known for his strip Julius Knipple, Real Estate Photographer, which was seen in alt weeklies, and more recently books like Hand Drawing in America and The Dairy Restaurant. So Gary's idea was to talk to Ben about something that they share in their past. When they were young men, they were involved in the comics fandom movement of the late 60s and early 70s. But crucially, this won't be a discussion that just hinges on nostalgia of 2 people involved in comics and what they did in their youth. In Gary's view, Ben and Gary did something different than their peers that were involved in comics fandom. Many people involved in that movement went on to, fandom had something to do with commercial comics, genre comics, superhero comics, sharing information about these things, discussing these things. And many people involved in it went on to work within that large corner of comics, maybe for a long time the largest, though no longer. They went on to work for companies like Marvel and DC. Ben and Gary obviously did something different in their artistic and critical and publishing careers. They dedicated their lives to a different kind of idea of what the medium can be. So maybe one thing we will get at in this discussion is why that is, what comics in the moment of fandom to them, what comics represented, what it seemed like they could do, and in 2023, what comics how they've evolved, how they might be defined, maybe in some ways how they haven't defined themselves, and how culture might still view them, maybe perhaps even more so than ever before, in the terms of fandom. Maybe most people now view comics much closer to the ideals of fandom than they view them in the terms that maybe our two participants view them. So these are all things that we can hopefully discuss and get at. Before I begin speaking to Gary and Ben, I just want to say something about people in the audience and people participating in this. I like to, maybe Ben would disagree with me a little bit. I like to think of the symposium as having a kind of unity between audience and speaker. I remember seeing one, I don't know if you remember this, Ben, but one live symposium event, like Olivia Shrowen was presenting, and the audience was like borderline harassing him. I mean, I don't want you guys to harass Ben and Gary, but they were being really asking really provocative questions to him. And I think it was, I think, well, I don't advocate for that. I do think there's something about, there is, the people watching this, I think they're probably immersed in comics more than many. So if there is something that you're interested in asking, I would rather you ask your question rather than suppress it. We really do want to have a discussion between you and the speakers. And so what you can do while they're speaking and while I'm asking them questions is you can write a question in the chat. You can note in that question whether you want me to read it out loud, or if you want to read it yourself, and we can turn on your camera and we can unmute you and you can speak to ask that question. But normally we wait for the presentation to be over to ask those questions. But depending on how things go, maybe we'll insert your question into what Ben and Gary are getting at. But I'll start things off now to talk to our two guests. And I really just kind of wanted to start off with this idea of, to describe maybe the first, and I think you both have prepared slideshows to go along with this question. But maybe if we could get at the first moment that you encountered, maybe not the first moment that you encountered comics, but the first consequential moment, the first moment that meant something to you with encountering comics as a medium, just looking at it and it meaning something. And from that moment, the passage from that moment into encountering fandom or maybe interacting with it, just to maybe give people a grounding in but yeah, just what your initial involvement in the scene was, and in the medium was, and then from that moment the passage into fandom. So I could start with you, Gary.
Sure. So let me sort of re-articulate the premise that Austin already told you, which was Austin proposed this and asked me what I thought we could talk about. And I think I gave him some half-ass idea to begin with, and then I thought about it some more. And I realized that one thing Ben and I share is that we both started off being hardcore comics fans in the 1960s. And that not only that, but that we were two of the very few people who moved from being hardcore comics fans to becoming the kinds of professionals we became. Most people in comics fandom moved into mainstream comics, corporate comics. And I was trying to think of people that I knew who were in comics fandom who moved into what you would call, indie comics or underground comics or alternative comics or literary comics, however you want to put it. And I couldn't come up with anyone except me and Ben. I'm sure there were probably a few people, but very few. So I wondered, like, how did we escape the gravitational pull of the kinds of comics that we fell in love with when we were kids, and that usually retains its hold on kids as they become adults, and then they become artists who draw Superman and Batman and Spider-Man. And so that's what primarily prompted this idea. And then I would like to talk to Ben about how we evolved a more sophisticated understanding of comics.
Right.
So I guess I can launch into that by talking about how I started out as a kid in comics, and maybe you could launch that. I have about 10 or 12 slides that'll give some historical background.
Yeah. Do you want to share? Do you want to share screen and bring that up, Gary?
Well,
I have it here too, so I can do that as well.
I don't have it. I don't have my slides in any kind of way in which I could show them. That's why I sent them to you.
Oh yeah. No, I got it.
I'm sorry. Do I just hit share screen?
If you have the PDF on your desktop, but I can also if you sent it to me, you can download it to your desktop. But I have it right here, ready to go. If you'd like to do that.
Oh, I'm sorry. I think you should probably do that because I'm inept.
Okay. Yeah. No. I will do that right now.
Substantially incompetent to do that.
Okay, just give me 1 second.
What's that?
It's some cartoon. I don't know.
Okay, can you see it, Gary?
I can. Are there 133 slides there?
I don't know. There's many, but we can.
I was hoping I just sent you like 10.
Well, if you want to skip any, just you let me know.
Okay, I'll try to do that. Can I manipulate these, or do you have to do it?
I'll do it.
All right.
So just let me know when you want me to go to the next one.
Okay, that shouldn't be there. Go right to the next one.
Okay.
And go to the next one. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay.
Maybe I sent you the wrong.
No, that's all right. Let me just see here.
Keep going.
Okay.
All right. Well, quickly, these were the kinds of comics that I was reading in the 1960s when I started reading comics. I guess I probably started reading comics when I was about 8 years old, somewhere in the neighborhood, 1962, 63. In that neighborhood, and these were the kinds of comics I read, and these were the kinds of comics that were being published. There were literally no other kinds of comics. They were all genre comics. They were dominated by superheroes. They were dominated by Marvel and DC, and a little bit by Archie. Next.
I'm having a little trouble just getting these. There's a little lag on them, unfortunately.
Yeah, I'm sorry. There might be too many, actually.
That's okay. I mean, the symposium is rough around the edges, and we have plenty of time. So there's no. Oh yeah. Okay. I don't know what's happening with this file. There we go.
All right. Well, this was my fanzine when I was. Let me see. This is 1968. So I started publishing a little comics fanzine when I was 13. And, I was utterly obsessed with comics, like a lot of kids that age. And comics fandom at that time was composed of kids between roughly what I was and college age. And this was, one of the terrible fanzines I published when I was that was January 1968, so I guess I was 13 at the time. And you can see I basically just stole an image from Marvel Comics and kind of pasted it all together. And stole a logo from the Fantastic Four, and created all of this at home in my bedroom.
I am moving on to the next slide. But there is a lag, so we'll just have to wait a little bit. Maybe I can.
And the next just half dozen or so slides are to basically emphasize how fanatical, but also how narrow the life of a comic book fan was back then. This is a kind of a famous photograph, which is also a snapshot of what the comics world looked like in 1969. This is a banquet that took place in New York, the New York Comic Art Convention, 1969. The banquet was honoring Hal Foster, who is, you can see at the end of the red arrow. Next to him sat a cartoonist named Gil Kane, who interviewed him. And this whole room is full of either working professionals at the time, or many comics fans who went on to become professionals, mostly at Marvel and DC. You can see artists like Al Williamson and Gray Morrow and John Buscema in this. And if you move it one more, you can see me in the front row to the right. And to me, this was like, I mean, this was the equivalent of going to some sort of like Hollywood banquet where you would, see Humphrey Bogart and Clark Gable and Marilyn Monroe. All right, next. There I am working on the fanzine that I was producing. And you can see I had a typewriter. To the right is a drafting board. There's a T-square there. I actually put, the fanzine together. Then I'm probably it's 1970, so I was 15. And I have my comic books, stacked very tidily. Probably the last time I had a tidy collection of comic books on the left. All right, next. Oh, and that's, yeah. And then finally, these are a couple of fanzines I published probably when I was about 17. So they were getting slicker. I was becoming a little more knowledgeable about how to put out a fanzine. But as you can see, I was still stuck in that world. I was still stuck in the world of superheroes and fantasy and science fiction and all the genres that comic books traded in. And that might be all we need, Austin. I'm not sure what the next one is.
Okay, we can. You had a lot of images from underground comics and then the more modern era, but yeah, we can.
That's true.
Also,
I did want to talk about. So this evolution from being a comics fan in the late 60s and early 70s, and when you're a kid, I wasn't aware of underground comics, which started roughly in 67 or 60, or so, depending on when you count it. I wasn't aware of those at all. I only started to become aware of underground comics in 72. And underground comics represented the first coherent artistic movement in the history of comics, in which a group of like-minded but paradoxically disparate artists formed a distinct movement in which they militantly felt themselves as artists. Previously in comic books and even in newspaper strips, the artists who worked there didn't really consider themselves artists. They considered themselves craftsmen. They considered themselves journalists. But they didn't really consider themselves to be artists with a capital A. The underground cartoonists did in their own unpretentious way. And so, you had Robert Crumb working in this was probably 1968 for the East Village Other in New York. And Austin, you could probably just burn your way through the next few slides. And I'm sorry I don't have a more coherent.
Oh no, this is great.
But so underground comics, started around '67. Represented an aesthetic that was diametrically opposed to virtually everything that mainstream comics represented. Mainstream comics were adolescent, mass market, pap, mostly created by hacks. And if they didn't adopt the hack mentality, they were more or less browbeaten into it by the edicts of publishers and editors who wanted exactly what they wanted, which was work that appealed to children. And so underground comics represented this liberation. When I started the Comics Journal in 1976, comics were in a pretty dismal place. Underground comics were withering. Arcade, which was a magazine edited by Bill Griffith and Art Spiegelman, was sort of the last gasp, pun intended, of underground comics. And that was published in, I think, May of 1976. And I published the first issue of the Comics Journal in July of 1976. And at that point, comics had sort of hit this low point. There were very few underground cartoonists who were, actively working or actively being published. Mainstream comics had hit a sort of low point, and that's when I entered comics, and I started publishing the Comics Journal out of a sense of revolutionary zeal, because I wanted comics to be seen as and treated like an art form, which I hadn't really seen up to that point. And I guess I should, and this is the crux of my idea for the talk, which is that how did I move from being this comics fan who put together this, this frankly, kind of dopey fanzine, putting out this reformist magazine about comics that wanted to practice serious criticism and serious journalism. And the simple explanation for that is that I finally educated myself about art. And when I did that, it was a revelation to me, because I realized that art wasn't just a distraction, it wasn't just entertainment, that it could represent something profound about the human spirit. And I was looking at, I was reading more widely. I was getting outside that very restricted realm of comic books, and I was reading a little more widely. The thing that really did it for me was I was introduced to film criticism in the 1970s, which had these amazing intellectual personalities dominating film criticism. You had people like Pauline Kael, Manny Farber, Andrew Sarris, Stanley Kaufman, Vernon Young, John Simon, and they all wrote about films as if they were life and death. I mean, they cared about film. They wrote about them as if they were art, and there was something at stake about art that there wasn't at stake about just producing entertainment, producing mass entertainment. And so I wanted to. So I finally realized that this is what art was, and the question I asked is why aren't comics like that? And then that was the premise of the magazine. And maybe I should end that portion of it there and let Ben talk about his evolution.
Yes, let's bring Ben in. There's definitely some stuff I want to ask you in regards to that, but let's bring in Ben first.
Yeah, the other, my introduction to comics was at the corner newsstand, and not newsstand, but candy store. In Brooklyn, there were candy stores, were places that had a soda fountain and sold magazines and candy. Very particular kind of store. And that's where there were racks of comics, but there were also newspapers. And even though they were the newspapers that had the really interesting Sunday comics were not the papers my family read, you know, they were the Hearst papers and the tabloids. I grew up looking at them. I'd have them buy them on Sunday for the comics. And that's, if you open the slideshow, it's all comic strips everybody knows. Like, I don't think I found examples from my childhood, but these are early. Well, there's a 52 Dick Tracy. So Chester Gould was still living. Harold Gray was still producing Little Orphan Annie. Our boarding house was running under, I think, the second artist, I forget his name, after Ahern, and Smiling Jack. These were in tabloids like the Daily News or the Mirror. And this was one world of comics that I saw. And then I saw superhero, you know, the Marvel and DC and Charlton comics in the candy store racks. And that specific tradition of the superhero comic. And so I was living between these two worlds. One was connected to this very old tradition of newspaper comics. One was something, you know, a little more recent, from late 30s, a superhero comic book publishing history. But they all involved drawing and figure drawing. And this was my introduction, that's Simon and Kirby, to the Western tradition of figurative art. So it had to happen, didn't happen in an art museum. It happened in the candy store. And, you know, the excitement of a good figurative drawing in a Simon and Kirby comic, I think, is still as exciting as in, you know, a drawing by Raphael. Different stories, you know. The other strange thing is I spent hours with my friends looking at these comic books, and we only spoke about the drawing. I don't remember anything about the stories, which is a strange thing. I once mentioned that to Michael Shaban, and he said, no, it was just the opposite for me. I was really interested in the stories. So the stories in these comics I was buying, they just didn't register. I understood it was all leading up to a fight. And then the fight gave the artist a few pages to do this amazing choreography with figure drawing. And
would you also be looking at, like, if you and your peers were talking about the drawings and comics, but not so much the stories, I mean, I imagine that you weren't also talking about contemporary illustration. It seems like maybe the drawing and comics.
Well, yeah, contemporary illustration was not that. I don't think as a small child I was looking at the kind of magazines that had, you know, too much drawn illustration. A lot of that was taken over by photography. Yeah. Anyway, I also, like in the second grade, discovered Tintin. There was an American edition of a few of the books. That was the next slide. And yeah, that was a revelation to me, just compared to what I was seeing in Marvel comics. And it was this, you know, I knew it was from some other culture, and it was much more low key. It was like a grade B movie. And the drawing, you know, the Hergé, that clear line drawing, was something I had never seen as a child. And it made a very big impact on me. And the
You would have
other,
been 7 years old.
what was that?
You would have been 7 years old.
Second, yeah, I remember I was very young, and I wrote to Golden Books, and I said, "Is there like a fan? I wanted to start a fan club for Hergé," and they sent me an envelope filled with 100 little 1010 fan club buttons that they had. I don't know. I've never seen them since. But I don't think I interested too many of my. This was a particularly interesting book to me, King Otkar's Scepter. And there were scenes in this book that were a very strong aesthetic moment for me as a child. And I've since gone back to try to look at them, and they've somewhat dissolved. I don't quite see them anymore, but they were definitely there. And after that, also at a very early age in the bookstore, I think it was in A&S, in the department store in downtown Brooklyn, I stumbled upon some Edward Gorey books. What they were doing there, I have no idea. I think The West Wing and The Unstrung Harp. And as a child, again, all of this was really a great alternative to children's books, which I found kind of boring, these approved books for children. So comics already sat in this, had a feeling of some kind of forbidden material, because, it was on the newsstand next to wrestling magazines and monster magazines and other things that were not approved by educators. So that made it interesting to me. Are you also having trouble moving through my slideshow?
Oh, do you want me to? I
Yeah,
keep
yeah.
having to.
Oh, yeah. Keep going. Sorry, I'll say next if you can.
Okay, yeah. Are you seeing it move? Because on
Yeah.
mine, I'm
No,
not
I'm
seeing it
not.
move. Okay, I'm gonna have
wait,
to.
I think. Wait. No, I'm not seeing it move for some reason.
Here, what I've been doing is I've been stopping it and then finding the PDF and finding the correct spot.
Okay. Well, you can
But
jump
we
ahead.
have a
But
patient audience,
anyway,
so let me get to the right slide.
yeah, it doesn't matter. Anyway, one day, I think I was in junior high school. Oh, anyway, my entry into fandom, I was in a used bookstore, probably in 1966 in downtown Brooklyn on, I think, Livingston Street. And there was thumbtacked on a bulletin board a postcard announcing the Academy of Comic Fans and Collectors Convention to be held sometime in the summer. And I wrote down the information and I went to that. It was, I think it was the Skyline Motor Inn over on 10th Avenue, but I'm not sure now. It might have been the City Squire. Anyway, that was my entry into fandom, and the Rockets Blast Comic Collector, which was a big a magazine that compiled ads, people selling comics and people publishing fanzines. And I think I met two of my friends who we ended up publishing some fanzines. This was I guess a late one from, I think, 69 or 71 that I did a cover for. But I think there may be, I don't have access to any of the earlier ones, but somebody might. But anyway, one day in junior high school, or early in junior high school, I found a printed copy of a penciled drawing by Jack Kirby, like a crowd scene. And I went into the half of the Brooklyn Museum. I lived just around the corner from there, had an art school in those days. And I went into the office and I said, I want to learn how to draw like this, figure drawing. I don't think I use those words. And I took a figure drawing class. And that, I happened to have a really great teacher, a guy named Andy Reese, who was a figure painter, but he was also involved as a young person in science fiction fandom. and he did some gag cartoons for the realists, so he knew all about comics. And so he didn't talk me out of making comics. He just said, well, you know, get to know the history behind this kind of figurative drawing, and it'll help you make comics or go on to do other things. And that's where I discovered the history of Western art. And then, I mean, I think by high school, I, you know, started reading the kinds of books that we read in high school, you know, Mark Twain. I think we read Dostoevsky. I discovered Saul Bellow and Philip Roth, things like that world of the mainstream literature of my youth. And my fantasy, what was that? How old was I? Oh, by high school or early college, I don't know. But the thing is, my fantasy was to take the drawings of, you know, Nicholas Poussin and combine them with the storytelling of Nabokov. Said, why isn't that happening? What happened? There was, you know, college in my years, early 70s, was still a really strong influence of high modernism. Painters were still not interested in storytelling, even figurative painters. There was an excuse to get out of the mannerism of abstract expressionism, but stories were not something they could talk about. And in the English department, no one was looking at pictures. Right. I mean, even the Dickens editions had no picture. The illustrations were gone. So there was that real split. So anything. The thing is, I had this childhood experience at looking at Dick Tracy. I knew these things could be put together, and I saw Edward Gorey, and I think it was in '71, David Kunzel's The Early Comic Strips came out. Yeah. And I said, well, there it is. This is just a lost tradition. Text and image, that was the norm. And in movies, of course, I was looking at movies, I was looking at TV. In college, I had one course with Tom Gunning, who was a film critic, historian. And so I knew all about, and there was in New York a really strong connection between movies and comics. The movie, there was a store, I think it was called Memorabilia on Cornelia Street, and they had comic books there and books about movies, you know, reprints of old comic strips. So that connection was clearly being made by some people. And it's just that the idea of drawing had been superseded by cinematography. And I dabbled. I made little Super 8 movies as a child, too. So, you know, I guess if it were easy, I found it very difficult. It was very expensive to shoot Super 8, and I had to work with these friends of mine, and it seemed comics, it was just an easier thing to do. So I gave up my movie making. But anyway, you know, so there was a step from there. By the time, so from at Brooklyn College, where I started college, there were already some figurative artists. Philip Pearlstein was teaching there, and a guy named Joseph Grohl. So I knew about a contemporary figurative art. These people were not interested in comics or in stories, but I went for a year and a half to SVA, where I had Robert Weaver and Jerry Moriarty as teachers. Moriarty was painting. He was not making comics in those years. Robert Weaver, who was a great American illustrator, did an issue of Graphis, a special Graphis, that European Graphic Arts magazine. He did a special issue in '72 in which he commissioned illustrators to make comics. And he thought this was a completely underused medium. And he loved the idea of wiring pictures for sound. That's how he put it, with drawing. And so another strange thing that happened to me as a child in fandom was I probably through, you know, the Rockets blast or through fandom, I got a letter from a French young man named Jean-Pierre Dionnet. And he wanted somebody in America who could send him American comics, and in return, he'd send me French comics. He went on in '74 to start, Metal Hurlant, the publishing company, Les Humanoids. And he became a major comics publisher in Europe. But we were in touch through the exchange of comics. And I think he sent me early issues of a Suivre. And I think I had sort of elementary, high school French, so I could make some sense out of them. But, so it was obvious to me that, superheroes was this tiny part of the comics world to me in terms of aesthetics, maybe not in terms of the market, So I can't say, that's how I was kind of introduced to other kinds of comics. There was no market for them. When I did a fanzine called Picture-story, I think in '78 and when I brought it around to comic shops in New York, thinking that they would, jump on this thing because this was like the future of comics, they said, "What is this? These are not comics. Why are you bringing these here?" They literally couldn't see black and white, the kinds of drawings that were in Picture-story 1 as comics. Phil Suling took some. He saw where this was going. But
and that would have been around 74, 70?
Yeah, Picture-story 1 was, I think, '78.
28, okay.
Yeah, and that's where I think Art saw my work, Art Spiegelman. And when he was starting Raw, he was looking for cartoonists. So it was, but there wasn't a market. There wasn't an alternative. No mainstream publishers were not doing graphic novels. So I stumbled upon, there was a man named Russ Smith who had a weekly paper in Baltimore, and he moved to New York to start a new paper, and he wanted original New York-based strips. And I said, the thing is, newspaper strips to me seemed like a pretty dead medium, but this is, by the 80s. I forget when that started, when I started Knipple. But I never thought of doing a newspaper comic. I don't know what I thought of doing with these comics. I guess self-published magazines or books, but I tried it, and that's where I sort of found an audience. And so those were not comic fans. People said to me, "I have no interest in comics. I don't read comics, but I like to read your comic strip." I don't know.
That's because comics fans at that time read only one particular kind of comic.
Yeah, I don't know. I knew a few people who were working for comics as colorists and inkers. I don't think I knew any writers or people who were penciling, but I think there probably were more comics fans who became writers than alternative comics. I keep hearing of people who loved comics and ended up being writers, or filmmakers. So I think that may have had to do with the fact that there was no market for these things, trying to make comics that didn't fit in the mold of mainstream comics or newspaper comics. And people were probably just discouraged. They said, how can I live doing this? I didn't think about it. Was very cheap to live in New York when I was starting out. And so I could make a bare living doing that. And I started a typesetting company with these two friends of mine, Charles Spanier and Larry Lee. They were both comics fans. But anyway, that's how it seems very obvious I wouldn't make superhero comics when I had all these alternatives that from a narrative point of view were more interesting to me. You know, the whole history of newspaper comics.
It sounds like your transition was much more natural and organic than mine. You know, I felt like I felt like I was stuck in mainstream quicksand, and I had to like find a vine and like pull myself out of it. And I barely made it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a lot of memories of early issues of the comics journal, but I know a lot of it was, you know, critiquing work that I guess I wouldn't have been looking at. So it didn't mean too much to me. And maybe I missed great things. I don't know what I missed. I may have missed, you know, I stopped buying most comics in '66 when Ditko stopped doing Spider-Man. I said, that's sort of, I have enough. I bought a few of his later things, but my buying of comic books ended at that date. I can date it exactly to that, July '66. So I had other things to look at, and you know, it wasn't quite as easy as it is today to look at the history of comics. But and you know, it was not an act, except that visual arts, that was the old cartoonists and illustrators school. So they had a tradition of teaching comics. But in the other academic world, the accredited academic world, not too many people that I ever came across were thinking about comics. They didn't fit in either department.
And you haven't mentioned underground comics, did
yeah,
you?
Right. I saw. I don't know what the first thing I saw, the East Village Other, and I saw some early Crumb. The biggest impact of underground comics was some strips by Kim Deitch, these kind of metaphysical things with, I guess it's with Waldo. And I said, I've never seen anything this believable an account of metaphysics. And I thought it was amazing. And then, you know, I saw Arcade. They were around a long time. They remained in a few bookstores in New York. So I saw all that stuff. I didn't try to pitch them anything. I didn't think I was doing anything good enough at that time. So it had to wait, I guess, till Raw. But anyway, you know, so I guess I gave up trying to be a publisher. I mean, I tried to put these fanzines out, these self-published magazines. You know, Picture Story 2 had a lot of color, and it cost a fortune to print you know, desktop publishing and stuff like that. So that you figured out how to make a publishing business out of this is just amazing to me.
Barely,
yeah. That sort of, I think, at the time when publishers, you know, mainstream publishers were not doing graphic novels yet, other than a few here and there. Pantheon did a few books before Mouse, And I guess the Eisner book came out, but I don't think it made a big impact.
Contract with God came out in '78.
Yeah.
It was really Mao's that made a big impact. But in '76, when I started the Comics Journal, the term graphic novel didn't really exist, and even more importantly, the concept of a graphic novel didn't exist. Nobody knew what that was, and the very idea that comics could be a legitimate art form was widely considered ridiculous, with the exception of crazy.
Yeah. I think people who grew up, in the golden age of newspaper strips in America, there were a few high points that people held up and said, well, and maybe the really strange stuff like Dick Tracy was not taken too seriously. But yeah, maybe it's just Crazy Cat and maybe Little Nemo. They kind of stood out. But, anyway, it was something, Kunzel's book opened up all this early stuff, these proto-comics. And that seemed to me, it was just a lost thread because it evolved from drawn picture stories to photographed picture stories and then sound and cinema. And it became, just like TV probably did a real number on newspaper comics as a visual medium. Film did the same. And so it was something you had to have an interest in the fetish of drawing, what that was all about, to want to make hand-drawn picture stories. It was easier, technically probably to film things, think about filming things. But and some, people did. I know, what's his name? Blanking out on his name, the great underground filmmaker, Jesus Christ. His brother, there were two brothers. Somebody must know who I'm thinking of.
I know who you're thinking of.
Kuchar.
The Kuchar brother, yeah. George Kuchar could draw. He could have made really good comics. But, film seemed to be, that had a kind of its own market, even underground films, that comics, finding an adult audience seemed to be a complication. I found it through, weekly newspapers, like Linda Barry was there and Matt Groening and
Wait, what year was your first newspaper strip?
I don't know. I'm terrible with dates. What was it? Like 80 something in the 80s, mid 80s, 86 or something?
You're already in, mid 80s, but in the late 70s, it seemed like an impossibility that comics could widely be considered an art form as opposed to just some, mode of entertainment for semi-literates.
Well, I still want to make entertaining comics. I've never given that up. So I think
there's no tension between art is always entertaining, but entertainment is not always art.
I think that's something I always aspire to. And doing a weekly strip, if people didn't have the patience to get through 8 panels, that was the night before I handed in the first episode of Julius Knippel, I thought it would be a continuing story like Little Orphan Annie or Dick Tracy. And I said, and it dawned on me, who's going to remember this thing week to week? And I redesigned it as a standalone weekly story. And that was sort of probably a good idea. And then by accretion, if you read it over a year, you sort of built out a bigger world view. But I didn't think a continuing strip would work very well. But anyway, but if if Art's book was the first thing that made a dent in the world of book reviewing, and then every publisher wanted to do a best-selling graphic novel, and people started teaching this in universities, that must have changed things.
You just summarized the last 45 years in the history of comics.
Yeah.
3 sentences. But in the 70s and 80s, you had to fight for the idea that comics were art. And
yeah, well, I think it's well known in history that Maus was rejected by every publisher in New York, including Pantheon. It was kind of on a second resubmission. Right. But so nobody, it was not because it was because it was about, people thought you just couldn't talk about the Holocaust in a comic. It was sacrilegious or something. So it had a subject matter issue there too. But Pantheon did a few kind of graphic books before that, but it wasn't a big part of their. No. And then there were New Yorker cartoon collections. The gag cartoon was another parallel universe.
I remember the reviewer in the New Yorker who wrote about Maus, and he said that this was too good to be called a comic.
Pretty funny. I don't remember that.
Well, I'd like to ask you, Gary, this idea that in the 70s and 80s, it's impossible to talk about comics as an art form, or that idea is emerging with people. I think part of that might be, it's hard to talk about something as an art form if the characters are talked about before the artists. And I'm wondering and that's something that I think you've tried to reverse as much as you possibly can with what you've done with publishing. But I'm wondering, your peers, for instance, your peers in that photo, I'm first kind of interested in how social this moment in time was and how many ideas were being exchanged that might get at what you guys are talking about now. But I'm wondering about the people in that moment, if you started sensing an opposition in yourself to, this is a medium made by artists, to maybe a different view that your peers might have had, or if there was an acknowledgement with people in that world that this was a medium built by artists.
Go
ahead, Gary.
My transformation happened a little bit later, because when I was putting out those fanzines through high school, I was still thoroughly immersed in that world, and that world was my social environment too. I was obsessed with comics, but I was also, all of my friends were obsessed with comics, and that's the the ocean I swam through. And it was only a little after that when I went when I went to college, and I had my eyes open to a much wider world, when I retroactively came to the conclusion that the comics could be, something far better than they traditionally have been. I'm not sure if I.
No, it's interesting, because that wouldn't be something that you're in this world and it is social and all your friends are involved in it, but that isn't necessarily something at that moment where it's focused on a different kind of information gathering.
Yeah. Yeah, and it was such a radical break at that time that a lot of people who I had known no longer knew where I was coming from, because I had kind of moved from that world, or their world, which was my world, to a new world, and there was almost a sense of betrayal.
So what were the models you had in mind in the early days of your critique of mainstream comics? What were you pointing to?
The models I had in mind were foreign films, like Bird.
Not comic. There were no.
Oh, there were no comics.
Okay.
I had to extrapolate from all the other art forms and say that comics could be the equivalent of these, even though there aren't any comics. And and the problem was there was this weird dichotomy. There were mainstream comics, which I contended were largely semi-literate direct, and then there were underground comics, which represented something you were getting to, Austin, which was my growing auteurist view of comics, that comics should be centered around the cartoonist, and preferably one cartoonist and not a separate writer and a separate artist. And that's where I was going, because in film, I think that the greatest films were usually done by a singular vision, a Bergman or an Antonioni or a De Sica or whatever. So I'm slowly coming around to that idea.
Did you? I just listened to the tape recording that Stan Lee made of his dinner with Alain Resnais. Did you ever hear that? That's online. It's pretty interesting.
Did not.
I think he says at one point, if I were not in this business, I would never be reading comics. So,
yeah, I
mean, and there's some interesting things in that little conversation. But yeah, so that was your, I mean, yeah, in the back of my mind, I grew up looking at movies, and I said, well, I saw some evidence of great comics. I saw it. They may have not looked like the mainstream comics, Edward Gorey and all these other early stuff in the newspapers. I knew there'd been these high points, and people did amazing things, just like a filmmaker. And so, yeah, I mean, I wasn't trying to convince anybody about that. So you had a real kind of journalistic,
I was,
mission. I don't remember having that.
No, I was evangelical about it. I mean, that was the purpose of the magazine, was to persuade people that comics could be art.
Yeah, but without just showing them all the examples. I mean, now at these early conventions, that photo is at one of the early Phil Suling cons.
69.
You had to pay extra to go to the banquet. So that's not everybody at the convention. I never went to those. I saved my money to buy comics, probably. So I don't know if that's even a clear, I think it's pretty much the demographic there, but people who went, it's not everybody. And these early Comic Cons were also people selling clipped newspaper strips, and people, there were some early reprints. Like I saw that the Will Eisner, The Spirit Daily at one of these early conventions. I remember buying a book of those. So you could see other things, and well, Hal Foster was there, so you saw him. But they were mainly just kids on the floor trading comics. And you could see EC Comics. I discovered that world, early Mad Comics. And so it was a little bigger than superheroes. That was a part of it, but I sort of was looking at all these other things I didn't know about or I was discovering. So, early, a friend of mine really got into Centaur Comics, and they had, what's his name, Fletcher Hanks, these really, and, Basil Wolverton, people like that who were not doing standard superhero type comics. But
was maybe like Lynn Ward and people who did for an idea, but before the emergence of, I mean, Ben, you were talking about encountering the Kunzel book and this interest in newspaper comic strips, which resemble what a mature expression of comics would be.
They were made for well, the strange thing is, when I heard the topic of this talk, I just assumed the answer was, well, I outgrew superhero comics. But there's a strange statistic that the median age of comic book readers is 35. So people don't necessarily outgrow comics, right? Now, I don't know if that's now, But I mean,
that brings us to, I think, a really interesting thing where, you know, there's this photo of this convention, and that moment now, the concerns of fandom culture are now, in a very strange way, the concerns of mass culture, right? I mean,
yeah, with superhero
yeah,
movies, right, right.
the intellectual property in these magazines has become so dominant, you know, and it's dominated film too. I think it'd be easy to make an argument in a very destructive way, I'd say. And so I'm kind of wondering if there was and I think part of why that's happened is that the artists working on these properties were paid a page rate. I'm sure there's been different kinds of lawsuits and legal maneuvers to get the families of Kirby and Ditko and the Seagulls, different, or not Ditko, but the Seagulls, some compensation. But no matter what compensation is done, the amount that they were paid for these pages versus the amount that these billion-dollar properties have brought in, it must be the most wide margin of all time. And I think that's partly why it's dominated mass culture so much, because of that feature, because these people were paid so little to work on these things. And I wonder, maybe this is specifically for Gary, but I'm sure Ben would have interesting thoughts on this. What kind of awareness was there of that with your peers? And when did you come to kind of a idea of that, or what are your feelings on, I guess maybe generally, what are your feelings about fandom culture becoming mass culture, and the economic realities that might have enabled that?
Yeah, I mean, the irony of my life is that while we were fighting to make comics art, or at least, you know, my conception of art, and comics have slowly, I think, finally, you know, between, you know, between 1980 and now, have achieved that kind of status. I mean, they are capable of art. It is now recognized that they're capable of art. And during that period, as comics ascended to become a genuine art form, the larger culture has become stupider and more illiterate, and has embraced the kinds of moronic comics that I eschewed, you know, from the 60s. And now, you know, those comics, you know, that I outgrew, and that you would think any adult would outgrow, have now become the dominant force in pop culture.
Why do you think that is, just off the top of your head, maybe?
Well, I think that pop culture cultivates a passive audience that consumes material that follows the path of least resistance. And I think with technological advances, you can now actually make stupid superhero movies that reflect the comic books from, you know, the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. And you can make those, you know, even more compelling than the comics were to, you know, to people like kids like me when we were 12 years old. So I just think I think it just perfectly tapped into the inherent infantilism of the American public. I mean, how else can you explain, you know, our politics today except through a kind of infantilism?
Well, video games, which I don't know, maybe even bigger than movies, you're actually a participant in the fight scene. I mean, what could a kid want more than that? You can actually be in the fight yourself. And so if that's what you want to do, I mean, and yeah, it's you know, opening up the possibility of this imaginative, you know, spatial drama that a comic has with a good figure artist, you know, like Ditko or Kirby. You know, where does the technological end game there is people saying, well, now you can be the character fighting. And why stop at looking at this from the outside, on a little crummy, badly printed comic book? So I think that's understandable why that's exciting to kids. I mean, I don't see little kids buying print comic books. I'm not that in touch, but I know them.
No,
playing
no, no.
video
I mean,
games.
the kinds of comics that we
So,
read as kids are now being bought by 40-year-olds.
So there are people who either have a nostalgic interest or still love the drawing and that genre, storytelling in a genre of superhero or other things. It could be other. I don't know if there's still war comics or cowboy comics or supernatural comics. Probably all these things exist, but I think literary fiction was never a big market. It was always subsidized by publishers, by better selling things, more sensational things, or utilitarian things. And I mean, I think probably as a publisher, you probably do the same thing. One thing subsidizes the thing that can't sell. So maybe we're looking at a kind of very rarefied market. I mean, I think when I was in a newspaper, I felt I broke out of that market because people had access to my comic strip, would never pick up a comic book, and they would never pick up, a fanzine and look at this stuff, or a self-published. They would never go to, Comic Arts Brooklyn. It's not likely. They just wouldn't. The form didn't interest them. And so I think if you come around to an audience through, this kind of indirect manner, you can find readers. But the same thing, though, happened with art film. I think the end of the kind of people you were talking about, that generation, I think their last films were not even distributed in America. There was no market at all for them, or they were edited down and mutilated. So,
yeah, I'm not sure. I have two things to say in response to that. First, you're right that a literary, for want of a better term, the audience for literary work has always been pretty rarefied. I mean, I remember, God, I think it was maybe it could have been 20 or 25 years ago. I remember reading, and I think it was an interview with Philip Roth, and someone asked him, "What do you think of the state of literary culture?" And he said, and I'll never forget this because, I saw what we were doing as analogous to this. But he said, he said literary culture is supported by about 5,000 people.
Yeah, that sounds about.
Books.
That's 10,000 is a runaway bestseller in the world of.
I tend to feel that's kind of true. I mean, I don't know if it's 5,000 or if it's 10,000 or whatever, but that's true of the kinds of books, the kind of graphic novels that we publish. The other thing I'll say, though, which somewhat qualifies this, is that, mass entertainment just seems to have gotten more credence. I mean, if you look back at the 40s and 50s and 60s, mainstream movies that adults would go to, were Westerns or detective movies, sometimes dramas, comedies. And now it's just dominated, by the most, idiotic, insipid, repetitious franchises. And kids and adults both go and are equally entertained. Now, that seems to me like a shift. I'm not sure when that shift occurred. It probably, occurred gradually, through action movies in the 80s and 90s. Yeah. It's like this de-evolution or something. But
well, I guess the whole idea of distributing art films became a money-losing proposition, and people said,
yeah,
the industry, the movie industry,
in the 70s and 80s, I think, of art films, and you could, you could go to repertory theaters and you could go to art theaters. I mean, here in Seattle, almost all the art theaters are gone. There's like one or two left. And when I moved here in '89, there was something like, I don't know, 7 or 8. And I don't know if that's true.
Well, video. People watch a lot of this stuff at home now. So I don't know that a theater, unless you're that much of a purist, you only want to watch a projected film.
Yeah.
I watch most film on a screen, a home screen. I don't.
Well,
So anyway, yeah, it's the bigger picture. That's hard for me to. I don't see all these movies. I do know, I know people who are kind of feel that they have to go to these movies to be part of the culture, and they sort of and when they tell me about these movies, I say I don't think I could make it through such a movie, but that's something people feel like. If you don't go, you're some kind of an elitist snob, and you don't want to be part of what interests most of the world. And
I spent most of my life advocating for elitist snobs.
Yeah, okay. So, obviously, I think there's a happy medium, but I think in the film industry, because these things cost so much money to make, it becomes a really hopeless, it's a sure money loser. In comics, they don't cost that much money to make. So we can make them. There are hundreds of people, Austin is distributing hundreds of comics. People are making these things because they don't cost millions of dollars to make. And that's what's saving the form, I think, that it is. It's just, you just need a place to live and food, and you can make comics all day.
Well, that's actually, I had a question about that I'd like to ask. I mean, if you at this time that you entered into comics and you had this obsession with a certain iteration of it, and now as adults, I think there's a social value to comics right now, especially in this moment. Rent is very expensive, education is very expensive. Maybe renting a studio to work on certain kinds of art might require a kind of a degree of money that might not be open to a lot of people. So one possible social function of comics right now is what you just said, Ben, that they can be made truly by all. They can be made by one person. And I'm kind of wondering what you might, and this is the last question I'll ask before we get into audience questions, because there's quite a few of them. But do you see did over the years, did you see a social function for comics, and maybe how has that changed?
I mean, I grew up in New York, and if you studied art, studio art, as I did, you went to galleries, and these were places where people were selling, paintings as expensive objects. Where they ended up, in homes of wealthy people or museums. And I saw that right away. I said, this is not the place I want to make my work. I don't want to make work for that audience. And comics, I had this idea that there are these things every child could buy for 10 cents. And that was the market I wanted to be in. So that was a real social decision, not to be in that other market. That's simple, very simple.
Gary?
Well, social. I mean, I don't think there was a social component. I mean, the social component was sort of ancillary or secondary to the my aesthetic priority.
Right.
I mean, I guess I thought, if I'm understanding your question correctly, the social would come when I exercise my aesthetic priorities in the Comics Journal and in what I published. Then all of my social connections would would follow forthwith. So I guess I didn't worry about the social element of it, and that wasn't really something I was consciously aware of. I was just, it was just dragged along with me wherever I went. I mean, but it has proved to be enormously rich because I got to work with and befriend people with whom I felt I had a kinship. I don't know if that even remotely.
I guess I mean more like what it might mean for people for this medium that is cheap to produce, for it to be available as an adult medium rather than a commercial medium. I've always kind of wondered about that conundrum, like this medium.
I mean, I think it's great. I mean, I think that the kinds of books that you distribute, for example, I mean, they're like an incubator for potentially good cartoonists. But at some point, you still hit the brick wall of commercialism. I mean, you still hit that how difficult it is to make a living as a cartoonist. I mean, there are very few cartoonists who make a living being a cartoonist. You either have to be in academia or you have to do commercial work or something else. So I mean, you still have that never-ending problem. I don't know if you're familiar with it. There was a report that came out last year in the UK. They spent a year or so, I think it was government financed, and they did this sociological report on cartooning in the UK. Are you familiar with this?
No, I don't know.
It's like I printed it out. It's like 150 pages, and it's full of graphs and statistics and charts. And they took a survey of every cartoonist they could find in the UK, and then statisticians came out and they analyzed the survey. And it's exactly as what you might expect. It's like 5% of the cartoonists in the UK earn their living as cartoonists, and 95% don't.
Yeah.
And it's broken down by gender, by race, in every conceivable way. And I'm sure it reflects the same thing that we're experiencing here. And that's quite possibly you experience in every art form, whether it's film or music. I mean, how many people actually make a living? It's just so difficult to do that, no matter how you have to confront the realities of an inherently indifferent marketplace. And when I say indifferent, I mean I'm just talking about the people who experience art. I mean they're programmed to just sit back and binge watch Netflix.
Yeah, I mean, the subsidy model of publishing, somebody had figured out how to make money selling something, maps or cookbooks that made money and then would subsidize a literary novelist. I mean, that was the model from before corporate, the big corporate takeover of publishing. And that, I don't think the corporate model ever worked. I think they thought it would work. If you did it on a big scale, you could pay people a lot of money to make books. I don't think it ever worked for most publishers. But
yeah, I mean, it could work. I mean, it has worked. Godine Publisher, the publisher there is David Godine. Black Sparrow Press made it work for about 20, 25 years. But these are very small scale operations that have no overhead. But making it work on any kind of significant level is just like,
well, if the publisher is owned by a conglomerate that makes its money from reality TV shows or something.
I mean, who is owned? I'm sorry.
No, with the large multinational conglomerates that own publishing companies, they're not making their money selling books necessarily. why they keep them going, they're merchandise to make movies from or other things. But yeah, so when the weekly paper world started to collapse, that's when I said I better get a teaching job, and there was still full-time teaching jobs. And
that's a kind of subsidy.
that was an old model. I remember you crossing paths with Philip Roth when he was teaching at Hunter. I mean, he taught, Bellows taught most of his life. Even these major names, I think, thought they better have a teaching job. You can't produce a book, every year.
Exactly. And how many significant writers in the 40s and 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s went to Hollywood to make?
Yeah, that was another option. But that didn't. Yeah, I mean, yeah, you can option. I've had my books optioned a few times, but whatever. There's that's the big question of why comics, alternative comics. It's still, I think people love print, the print form. If you go to, Brooklyn Comic Arts, it's like the internet doesn't exist. Everybody's walking around with paper. So that's a really mysterious turnaround of the direction of technology. And, that it theoretically limits their audience because of the cost. That's part of the issue. But, it's I think it's something journalists and writers are working out online, whether there's such a thing as a subscription model or what these subsidy models are today, what they should be. But
I want to get to some of these questions that people in the
sure.
have been very patient. So I'm gonna I have a couple of, I'd like to keep asking questions, but I'll refrain for a second. Generoso asks, my question is for Gary. Like you, I too was enthralled by how film criticism in the US began looking at cinema with urgency in the 70s, and can see you wanting to review comics in that way. But was there also a particular underground or mainstream comic that you first felt demanded that same level of serious critique?
Yeah, that was the question I asked.
What's that?
That was the question I asked you a while ago. What were the models you were holding up? And you said there really weren't that. You were looking at movies.
The underground comics, the answer to that is no, but it's not because underground comics weren't an exemplar of excellence. It's because that they were so sui generis. They were so, they weren't. I mean, as I became more knowledgeable, they kind of resisted what you might call literary analysis. So many of them were just batshit crazy. You had Wilson and Rory Hayes, and and Crumb was just such a vast protean talent who could do anything. To engage them critically, you really had to have some sort of a different vocabulary from anything that had preceded in comics, or anything from film or literature, or you had to agglomerate all of these and try to analyze them. But and I have an enormous amount of respect for underground comics. I probably published more underground comics work than any publisher in the world, and they served as a template, because all of the best underground cartoonists were, they embodied a unique sensibility and a unique style. So they were almost like the platonic ideal of great cartoonists.
So, Garrett, what was the first book you published that wasn't the Comics Journal? When did you actually say, I'm going to publish a comic?
Was that? one of the very earliest ones was Jack Jackson's Los Tejanos. It was a graphic novel that Jack, who was an underground cartoonist, was working on, and Jack specialized. He originally did this incredibly brutal satirical work, and then he moved into doing uh, historical graphic novels in serialized comic book form that eventually became graphic novels. And he specialized in Texas history because he was a Texan. And Los Tejanos came out in 1981, and that was among the earliest books that we published. And then we published Love and Rockets in 1982.
And did those immediate, start breaking even or making money, or not for a while?
They more or less broke even. I mean, there were probably 3 or 4 of us who worked, in the company at the time, and we all lived in a big house, and we worked out of a big house, so we had no overhead.
Right.
So we didn't have to make any money, and we could publish something and barely break even. And we had a distribution network set up because of the Comics Journal. This was during the early period of the direct sales market, so we sort of had a distribution system in place, so we could publish a book like Los Tejanos, or a year later Love and Rockets, and we could get them distributed. And we didn't have to make any money. All we had to do was make enough money to feed ourselves and pay rent.
Yeah.
One of the things that you talk about there is that these underground comics kind of resisted a literary criticism approach. And I think we've spent a lot of time talking about films in relation, comics in relation to foreign film, comics in relation to other, mediums that had achieved some kind of degree of seriousness in people's minds. And I'm wondering if, as time has gone on, if there's things that, and I think in the description you wrote, Gary, that you initially thought of things as literary comics or comics as a form of literature. And I'm wondering if for both of you, there's aspects of comics that are, when I look at Crazy Cat, I can't really define that as something that's something that's exploring itself. That's something that's exploring the form of cartooning itself, rather than something that's approaching the sophistication of foreign cinema or acclaimed literary movement. So I'm wondering if for you, there's things that are core to comics as they express themselves as a serious form that are independent to comics, or what those might be.
No, I see it, comics, as part of this theater to cinema tradition. So the pure comics, that's a dead end to me. Purifying the form, that's the same thing as high modernism. Yeah, I don't see that as. I think Crazy Cat was interesting because it was a really amusing kind of writing, all these different voices, these vernacular weird voices, and this kind of storytelling. So I see it as part of this larger text image tradition. Nothing, it happens to be, we draw as though we lived before the invention of photography. But I've done theater, and so I don't think too much about that. Anything unique, pure comics doesn't interest me too much.
But Ben, do you not think that comics is uniquely what it is, just in the same way that film or prose fiction is uniquely?
No, I think it's a kind of text image storytelling, and I think you could move between them. I could make theater. I'd be just as happy making theater in a way, and the same feelings of how language moves in time and space. And if you're doing comics, you better figure out how to do it with drawing and writing and moments, not continuous flow of, time. But no, because where does that lead you? It leads you to thinking, there's such a thing as the perfect pure comic, and that they tried that. That was the problem of modernism. They tried to squeeze storytelling out of painting and pictures out of writing, and that's a dead end. Obviously, we like them because it's this messy multimedia form, and so yeah. No, I think the people defy, when a good thing happens, it's like a miracle, and it defies anything you would have thought of doing. You say, well, why would you do that? And that somebody does it, and they make it function in a really exciting way. That brings up the whole issue of, as people have to teach to make a living, the academization of comics. And I'm sure you've seen that, getting submissions of comics. People have these models in mind, like, this is a good comic, just do that and it'll be another great doesn't tend to work like that. No. So that was the death of, every art form becomes, if it lives to have an academy or an academic angle to it, people who want to be artists say, well, this is how you do it, no problem. And it makes really bad, boring art. So that happens in every form,
What you just said about pure comics, I'm reminded of Hitchcock's pure cinema. Wow. And I think what he meant, if he indeed coined that term, and Truffaut didn't coin it, I think what he meant by that was that what he was doing could only be done in film.
Well,
the way he expressed himself was uniquely expressed using film, whereas so many films,
well, really... I don't know if he tried to do the thing. Though he was an art director. He started out as an art director for films. So a lot of people don't try other things, and so they wouldn't see how these sensibilities translate. But I think and they sometimes think it's competing with their own work, like Saul Bellow never gave the rights to make movies of his work. He didn't want to make them himself, but if he had wanted to, he, I think, could have invented great stories and figured out how to do it. So yeah, of course it has its unique form, and if that's all you made, that's what we're looking at. My comics or somebody's movies. It's not an abstract thing.
I guess what excited me was the capacity of comics in using or expanding upon the vocabulary of comics to tell the kinds of stories that you eventually told, starting in the mid-'80s, for example. And in a way, the vocabulary of comics needed to be expanded and refined. It was there, it was lurking under the surface, but it needed artists like yourself to expand it. If you look at your work, and I don't know, you look at really well-crafted comics from the 40s and 50s, and there were a lot of them. The stories were always brainless, but they were well-crafted comics by, great artists like Mort Meskin or whoever. Someone like you actually expanded the grammar of comics, like how to tell a story.
Yeah, I think if you look back at Topfer, I think a lot of these things were worked out. Not many people wanted to do it for the reasons of the academy. The thing was, if you wanted a career, you became a painter or a writer. And the people in this weird in-between place, they wanted to do, lots of novelists, aspired to be playwrights and do theater, and they couldn't make it. And so you're lucky if you can find a form that you can work in. I would say that's true. You know, whether Hitchcock would have been a failed cartoonist, who knows? Maybe if he was lucky to find the form that he could make some successful work in. But I don't. But so what? But that doesn't answer the question of pure comic. He happened to make movies, and really good, entertaining movies. So I think it's lucky. I mean, and also these multimedia forms are really difficult, because if you talk about, a great technician with mindless stories, I mean, a comic, if it's bad on so many levels. It's just like painful to contemplate. So same with movies, you get, and all these movies where they get the star screenwriter and the great cinematographer and the great set designer, and they make a bomb. So what happened? They knew what the medium was. They made great people make things. They make bad things. They make good things. So anyway, yeah. Anyway, it's just that purism has such a hopeless connotations from high modernism. It's everything against what makes comics exciting.
You really hate high modernism.
It was what I grew up in, and it would have stopped me from making comics. So how can I have any?
No, I'm not going to.
Yeah, and I don't see that it led to any to lots of dead ends.
Yeah, yeah, and
the world of young people making comics now, because that's its very nature is that it defies medium specificity. It's all kinds of weird things coming together, language but anyway,
I wouldn't push pure cinema or pure comics, and I use that term advisedly, but I see that Steve Solomon mentioned Gilbert Hernandez's Holidays in the Sun as pure comics. And I was going to say that, I think Gilbert and Jaime Hernandez, for example, expanded the vocabulary of comics so that they could tell more nuanced stories and more humane stories. And if you look at film, you have filmmakers like Bresson or Bergman who somehow adjusted the capability of the medium to tell, profound stories that, that your typical Hollywood director was not going to do. I mean, they had a set number of things they could do, and they did them very well. But if you look at the French New Wave, the British New Wave in the 60s, people like John Schlesinger, they were using the medium in a different way. And I think analogously, that's what happened to comics, beginning with the underground comics, who broke the barrier of subject matter. I mean, they could do anything, autobiographical stories, hallucinatory stories, or anything. And then another generation of artists started expanding the grammar of comics to make the art form more eloquent.
That's right.
We're part of that too.
Any more questions? What's that?
Yeah, no, I think I'm glad I asked that question, because I think I know Ben has I knew it would create a good conversation between the two of you. I want to move on to more audience questions. Randy Globus asks, do you think Lichtenstein's comic book type paintings had any influence on comics being considered a higher art form? This will be an interesting.
I think the opposite. There's a documentary. He sitting there looking through comics to find these formalistic images, and he said, "I have no interest in storytelling." So no, he has nothing to do. That's just pop art merchant being pushed by the art world as a new racket. a new thing to sell, after abstract expressionism. So yeah, I don't know. I don't think so.
I agree. I think what gave it its cachet in the fine art world at the time was the very fact that he took this dreck
Right.
and created so-called high art out of it. But
Yeah.
I and
No, he was a formalist painter who wanted to avoid all of what people saw as kind of the dead end of abstract painting, and bring back this thing that makes the image that's could be a soup can or a comic strip page. And I don't think it has much to do with the kind of comics
I showed
we make.
students in a class, a Mike Sikorsky page and what Lichtenstein took from it, and kind of tried to just get their reaction about, appropriation is discussed and plagiarism is discussed a lot by younger students these days. And I kind of just wanted to see how they reacted to these things. And one student, it was very touching. They were just saying, oh, well, I feel like Mr. Sikorsky must have felt very bad, or like he was being made fun of, this. And I thought that was a very genuine, heartfelt reaction to it. And I'm wondering, as you guys were involved in, were interested in people making artwork in that time, and maybe had access to them through fandom, or maybe your peers, what maybe were professionals and fans' reactions to Lichtenstein as it was happening, if any?
I think Mr. Sikorsky was pissed off.
Yeah.
Lichtenstein could appropriate his work and make millions of dollars from this strip that he got paid $8 a page for.
Yeah. I think these were redesigned images based on these panels. That's not absolute, lifting the image. So he redesigned them based on an existing image. But yeah, it's not plagiarism per se. It's just using it as a subject matter, Just like you draw an apple, you don't say you stole the apple. Just an object that a human being made it. That's, just besides the point, I guess, to him. So, but no, the only influence it had, I know, in France, there was kind of a style for a while to blow up panels from comics and put them on the wall at an exhibition and say, here, there's a Jacques Tardy, like a full-size painting. I mean, things like that were going on in the world of exhibitions. People didn't know why, if they wanted to show comics on a wall, what do you do other than blow up an image? And then it happens to end up looking like a blown up Lichtenstein, but it's out of context again. The story gets thrown away. So.
I think that to me is the big thing that shows maybe a public misconception about comics, that the sequence is taken away in Lichtenstein, that's the building of sequence.
Well, the text, relevant. Yeah, it's out of context. But
Ben Fraser wants me to ask you, Ben, what did you have in mind when you started the radio cartoons of the Knippel strip?
Oh, they were done. Somebody did an interview with me at NPR, and they said, well, how do we talk about a visual form on the radio? And the producer, David Isay, said, well, we'll make, early 20th century radio dramas out of them, and we can play a few of them. You could hear them at least with actors playing the parts. And, it was fun to do. I think it got a little broader than the strips would read, because there were, incredible comedians reading the parts. But yeah, it was fun. He did I think there were about 10 of them, and they ran for a while on Weekend Edition. And yeah, it was kind of an amusing angle. Audio comics, or they were little radio dramas, and they had to be strips that worked in a perfectly linear way. So there's, the form of comics. Some of my weekly strips have to be read more than once to understand what's going on, and those would not work on the radio. So we had to pick stories that had a kind of a real linear narrative, and but they also existed as comics.
This doesn't have to be the last question, although we are coming up on the 2-hour mark, and I don't want to keep you guys for too long. But if people have more questions, I encourage you to write them as I read this one. This is a good question to tie things up. It's from Danny Fingeroth. Would Danny be a peer of yours in the would you guys have been peers in fandom perhaps, or do I have that incorrect?
Maybe.
Well, we're hello.
Hey, Danny.
Yeah. We're similar in age, but I was not active in fandom.
Not everybody who ended up in the comic book industry was in fandom, and not everyone who was in fandom. Some of them ended up being accountants and doctors and other things.
Yeah,
I was a sullen loner enjoying comics.
Oh, you were making them yourself?
No, I was a sullen loner enjoying them. I didn't see any need to like join a club. It just as like I felt the comics were the club. That was the power they had over me. That I felt by reading them, I was in a club already of the people, of Stan and the other people making the comics and the people reading them. It was a very powerful thing.
Yeah, and so you didn't go to conventions or
entered the professional field who didn't come from fandom.
Huh?
I said there were 2 or 3 people who entered the professional field who didn't come from fandom.
Really, that's all you think?
No,
Oh, I don't know what the statistics are, but it is fascinating that people think about. I mean, since I was making fanzines as a child, I always thought I was never not in publishing. I was self-publishing, but I was definitely. It's not like people say, "Well, how did you get into publishing comics?" And I said, I just did it as a child. I mean, what? That's like
there were like 3 people that I went to school, elementary school with, who were also into comics. So I don't know.
What did they become?
One became a dentist and a lawyer.
Wow.
Let's see. One guy is a big advertising executive. I don't, those are the 2 I know of. But they retain this fondness for comics. At least the comics of their youth. They like, it has a very special spot for them in I guess nostalgically.
And you had a really good question that relates to that.
If
you want to ask it.
Okay. This is a smart-ass question with a less smart-ass follow-up. Question was, Ben, if Ditko hadn't left, would you still be reading Spider-Man?
No, I followed him to these other books that he did, and at some point, they just less and less there were, until I must say, I think all of this objectivist stuff he ended up doing, this Mr. A and all that. I think that's kind of in the history of people transitioning from doing superheroes to something personal is kind of fascinating. That he really thought comics could be used as this philosophical diatribe. I think that's amazing. I think it's kind of interesting. I haven't read them all. I don't know too many other of all these really kind of literate people who were in comics, like Gil Kane and I don't know who else. The people who worked with Warren, blanking out on all these names.
Hollywood or Craig.
Yeah, they all could have. Yeah, when I showed Robert Weaver Wits End, I said, "Here, these are these cartoonists doing they're in control now." And he said, "Well, they're doing the same thing they were doing when they worked for the comic companies. What's the big deal?" He just didn't see it as like a breakthrough for them.
Now, in a way,
it's all relative what a breakthrough is, but
there are very
anybody.
What?
There are very few. I'm sorry,
Gary. Was there anybody? Besides Ditko, was there anybody who went? in a total different direction like that?
There were
Well,
cartoonists who became painters. They gave up comics and became
Right.
serious painters. That's a
Well,
direction. But what were you going to say? Who were you
there
going
were
to?
artists. There were artists who broke out of. I mean, it just seems so hard. Once you're in it, it's so hard to break out of mainstream comics. So I remember, Gil Kane tried to do it. He tried to do it several times and failed every time. He did it with His Name is Savage in 1968. He did it with a paperback graphic novel called Black Mark in something like 1979. I'm sorry, it might have been earlier. It was earlier than that. In fact, it was substantially earlier than that. And he did it with Starhawks, which was a newspaper strip, and he couldn't do it. He would always tell me that trying to break out of mainstream comics was like trying to break out of Sing Sing with a spoon.
Well, you could say maybe Bill Sienkiewicz went in a lot of different directions.
Yeah, but not narratively. I mean, more in terms of a painter, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I would cite Barry Windsor Smith and his last graphic novel, Monsters, as being a huge change from what he had done before. I mean, it's a significant achievement from someone who started out in mainstream comics and made his name in mainstream comics and flourished in that context. But there are very few. Craig Russell, I think, is one.
And what about, you'd have to say Eisner. I mean, that would sort of be he certainly.
Eisner's unique in that his literary work is worse than his pulp work. I would say that.
But at least he tried something different.
Yeah, he did try.
Could you maybe get at that a little bit? Like that definitely would be a different view than many have, Gary. So would you maybe want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I've written about it. I can summarize my writing about it. Eisner was a formal pioneer in the 1940s when he was doing his Spirit strip. He broke down that strip in a way that comics had not been broken down before. I mean, in terms of panel configurations and in terms of manipulating the timing by graphically. And those Spirit stories were pulp derived, but he was able to tell these very charming, sometimes very human stories that combined kind of elements of comedy and drama, and they just worked beautifully. And then, of course, he did A Contract with God in 1978, I think, and he tried to recreate himself in the image of Isaac Bashevis Singer, and I proceeded to do another dozen graphic novels in that vein. And I frankly don't think he had the sensibility to pull that off. He eschewed all of his formal innovations and created a much more staid approach to comics. I mean, it was most of his comics, at least Contract with God, was sort of borderless, borderless panel sequencing. That's the extent to which he innovated, in those books. But he was striving to be literary, and I don't think that fundamentally he just had the sensibility of a Saul Bellow or a Malamed or a Philip Roth.
Well, Ben, I know you're a great fan of Eisner, correct? Do you have a different?
No, I do prefer the Spirit. But the thing is, I think Michael Chabon talks a lot about this in this great divide between genre and literary fiction. The genres free you up on some level to do things that you maybe harder to come about if you don't have that framework to work in. The detective story, the thing that has to lead up to a fight, so maybe, that's maybe part of the issue, but as it's a complicated thing. He's somebody is an amazing draftsman and can, draw anything. Maybe in some cases the genre limitations are more inspiring in a way, or bring out more invention. And if you're, open to every possible, all the literary possibilities in the world. So I don't know.
For the heart of the storm, I think he came pretty close.
Yeah, I don't mean, I'm not I'm very far from a comics historian or critic, and so I actually only read a few of those books. But so I'm not a great it's not something I can talk about too much, other than my early, those dailies, those spirit dailies, which I think he actually drew, right? I don't think those were posted. I think he drew.
I don't think
he
did. No, I
He
think
didn't draw them?
that was when he was in the army. I think that was other people mostly doing it.
Pfeiffer and Wood were assistants, correct?
No, this is early. I think it's earlier than the.
I think it would have been Lou Fine and Jack Cole, I believe.
Okay.
Doing the daily.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I guess.
But anyway, if you invent a studio style that other people can use, that's they were kind of impressive, and I saw them as a kid. There was nothing quite that atmospheric in the comics I was reading, contemporary comics. So,
but let me just recenter you guys a little bit with Daniel's question. Where are there things maybe? I'm wondering if Gary is trying to get at something where he's maybe even someone like Krigstein, the genre limitations might mar a lot of what he could do without those limitations. But I'm wondering if there's things that you look back at from that time that are still evocative, that still feel connected to what you're interested in now. From what you were deeply engaged with then, that don't have that you're not saying, well, it would have been better for this reason or that, if it still just like shines through as relevant to you in how you interact with the medium today.
Well, I mean, I think some of the EC work still holds up, and you mentioned Krigstein. I think Master Race still holds up, and I remember Krigstein did an adaptation of a Ray Bradbury story, and it was, and he did a brilliant job of it, and it was entirely because of the way he cut that story up and turned it into comics. It wasn't just an illustrated prose story. He turned what was a prose story into comics. He was one of the few artists at EC. Harvey Kurtzman was probably the other one who wasn't an illustrator, but a cartoonist, a narrative cartoonist who used the medium. So yeah, I mean, there are a lot of great comics. John Stanley's Little Lulu, I think, stands out.
Gary, excuse me, but I think my question, and I think Austin interpreted correctly. If you picked up one of those Marvel comics that you had shown in the first slide and read it now, would there be any satisfaction, or is it just like?
Well, there would be a visceral satisfaction. I mean, I still think Kirby is a brilliant cartoonist. The problem comes in when you read them, because they're just kind of stupid and they don't hold up in that sense. I mean, it's so difficult. It's never to be recommended that you revisit a film that you loved when you were like 14 or 12 or something, because it's invariably going to be, a terrible disappointment. And those comics are like that. I think Kirby's best work was done in the 60s for Marvel. Mm-hmm. Again, it was his best period. It was his most imaginative period. He drew the best. He told stories the best. But the stories are just, they're just, nonsensical soap operatic drivel. but you can't fault Kirby. I mean, he's just a brilliant storyteller and such an inventive artist. And I'd say Ditko's the same way. Ditko is just such a good artist that you can look at those Spider-Man or Doctor Stranges or the early Hulks and still come away with an appreciation.
Mm-hmm.
So viscerally, I think yes.
Okay, well, that's
But in terms of a wholeness of vision, no. And it was that wholeness of vision that I wanted to see comics achieve.
yeah, I get it.
Ben?
Yeah, no, I mean, I can appreciate the drawing still, but even as a child, the stories just didn't do much for me. So,
You were
but
years ahead of me.
yeah, I don't know. I just literally, it was like this thing going, like background chatter, and
Uh-huh.
the spatial drama was the drawing, and everything else was like a non auditory background noise to me. The text of the comics, those comics. I mean, could be because I didn't become a writer, and maybe writing, it was one was seemed so amazing, and one just seemed like it wasn't going anywhere. As far as my childhood appreciation of writing, and uh, I can't say I've gone back to restudy them to say if I was missing something, but it's possible. I don't know. I haven't.
Well, if it didn't connect you with you as a child, it's unlikely.
No, well, no, it could be the opposite. There could be something you didn't get as a child that was beyond
That's true.
that mythology that they were trying to build.
You might appreciate the Stanley dialogue now.
No, what? I don't know.
Just
I don't
kidding.
know. I haven't tried to reread them. I've looked at them occasionally, and I show them to students who are interested in figure drawing. Uh, and the thing is, they were doing the Marvel system. They were doing the breakdowns and the storytelling, the visual drama, the spatial drama was all worked out by the artist. And then somebody came around and filled in the text like they needed it. I don't know. Maybe they didn't they needed it all. They could have.
I was with Michael Chabon when I was a kid reading those comics. I mean, I couldn't separate the writing from the drawing. I mean, the stories. I mean, I was just.
Yeah,
Yeah.
meaning.
So,
Yeah.
he became a writer, and I mean, you write too. So that's where, I mean, it works on both levels. But as I said, I had that terrible experience of going back to these 10-10 sequences, and this thing that was so breathtaking to me as a child, it's like it evaporated. I said, where is it? Like, am I missing the panel? What happened to that thing? And so that was like really in the story, somehow in the storytelling. But anyway, it's
Well, maybe we could end on this idea where Ben, you're talking about showing work to students today, and Gary, you work with very young cartoonists. Maybe we could talk about the difference to end things on where maybe when you guys were starting to interact with cartooning, what young people brought to it artistically, or how they thought they had to define themselves, and how it's changed as time has gone on. How you see that with students, maybe like what their expectations for the medium are at when they enter Parsons versus maybe someone who was 18 when you were first becoming interested in comics.
Well, the big influence of manga, and there are lots of students who aspire to work in that style. I don't think I've ever had a student, at least in recent memory, who aspired, to work in American comic book, that style, and any of those styles. So they're looking at everything else. as far, and it was kind of on some level a definition of commercial art and commercial illustration, and they are looking at, they'd rather see a child's drawing of a comic strip. At those festivals in Europe where they have competitions, the earliest children's comics are always the best. Everything else pales next to these things little children draw. So that's where, a lot of people's taste is, outsider art and anything but trained commercial art. So
Yeah, I see
except,
that.
these weird people who, I don't know how they existed, Chester Gould, how he made it. But he started out a little bit more traditional and then got stranger and stranger as he went along. But yeah, wait, does that answer your question? I think.
Yeah.
I could, my sense is that the younger cartoonists that we publish and that maybe I read, they don't come with a baggage.
Yeah.
And that might be a polite way of saying they don't know the history of comics, but they have influences outside of comics, and they might have influences in the last few years of comics, or their friends who draw comics, but they don't come saddled with all the history of comics and all.
Oh yeah, that's a good thing.
Yeah,
I came to try making them thinking about 18th century figure drawing and 20th century literary novels, not comic. I think that's the healthy way these things get made. I mean, if you say I want to just that's the opening line in my course on comics is, if you want to make comics like anything you see out there, just go get a job as an assistant. That was a tradition. You worked as somebody's assistant, you mimicked their style, and you could have a career. Whether that would work today, in this current publishing world, I doubt, but that you can do that. You can just say, I want to draw like Hergé and try to do it and or if you want to do something else, then you open up all these other possibilities and, problems, and it could all backfire on you. It becomes very complicated. But that was the old model. Young cartoonists like Ditko went to, study with Jerry Robinson, and then I think he worked with Meskin, and he was imitating them. It's obvious. He just got a little better, I think, or more. He pushed it in the really So
he became stylist.
Yeah, he really pushed the stylization to an interesting angle. So that's how it usually works. But the people you say they come with other non-comic influences. That's amazing. Somebody who says, I want to make something that's like a Paul Taylor dance in comics. No one has done this yet, How can I make a comic strip about somebody walking across the stage with nothing? No, and something interesting. It can be, there's a lot of, failed art,
To bring it full circle, that was one of the advantages the early cartoonists of the teens and the 20s had. They didn't have role models that they could copy, or
Oh, you mean these? Yeah, early. Yeah, people were looking back at Gilray, and people had some historical sense, but probably a broader, hundreds of years they might have been looking back.
Exactly.
But not like an immediate style they wanted to adopt. So,
and there was a lot of that in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, I think, where you had generations of artists who simply wanted to replicate what they loved from being fans. And most of it was just watered down versions of what they loved as fans.
Yeah, that's a dangerous. I remember as a small child looking at Hergé and saying, "This is there. It is. There's a perfect solution to how to make a comic." And I remember saying, "But you know, he did it. I'm not going to try to draw like that." He did it, and that's I got to go on somehow. So I don't know how that occurred to me as a child, but it did cross my mind that there were these solutions to be avoided. You know, you could do it. You know, Just Svarte pushed it, picked up on that kind of drawing style and went in some other directions. But so it's possible. I didn't know how to do it. I didn't think I, but
You were precocious. It took me years to figure that out.
oh, not to, yeah. Well, yeah. And then the other big divide was young kids who wanted to immediately try to draw like the comics they were reading, and then people who couldn't, whether because they weren't as facile. And I was sort of in that camp. So I never sat down to copy, to try to draw like the heroes that I had. I just said, this is not going to work. It's going to be a disappointment. So I just said, I'll do these primitive things. I can figure out how to draw and, you know, draw from models and draw from life and see how I can push my drawing, but not to pick up on an existing style, mimic a style. But that's, yeah, I don't know, it works for some people. And then they go on. I don't think I had the facility to try to do that. So,
Yeah, that's what Jules Pfeiffer said.
yeah, is that true? Yeah.
He tried to imitate Milton Caniff and he couldn't do it, so he had to draw like himself.
Yeah, that seems to be a healthy thing to do.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah.
the market reality is that he ended up making something that, you know, couldn't fit in the mainstream, and he had to go to the village, end up in the Village Boys, which was, you know, a great thing. But I don't think
Well, you're kind of describing like an artist going through like you know, coming at the medium with certain preoccupations of wanting to be Kniff and then having to become reborn into their own style. And that's kind of what you both did, going through fandom and becoming reborn through comics through your own interest in it. And it seems like what Gary might be suggesting, I'm just trying to tie things to a very optimistic end, that maybe comics as a whole is capable of it becoming that wildly inventive moment of the early days of news. My favorite moment.
Oh, I think the great thing about these earlier publishing moments is that there was a business model. And so even if you got some lousy page rate, you could live off of that if you produced enough work. Or if you had a newspaper strip, yeah, that was like having a TV show. It was gigantic money in that. If you were
missing that.
Yeah, I think these publishing models need to also be reinvented or something. I don't know if reinvented or just rethought how.
I think the readership needs to be reinvented.
Yeah, that's the big catastrophe in France and in other parts of Europe. There are more comics being made than readers. They actually think more people are making comics than buying them, which, you know, that sounds on some level like a strange thing, but I think that's a kind of that's one of these the dilemma of publishing there, where a lot of things are somewhat subsidized, some publishing, and so that could happen too. So you need, yeah. So I always loved the idea that my readers had no interest in comics. They were not trying to make them. I don't know what their interest was in, you know, having some kind of weekly revelation. It could have been an article. It could have been a comic. It could have been anything, a photograph. And
that was important to us in the '80s to reach people who didn't read comics with the comics we were publishing, and that was an important goal which we did not reach.
And you think you did? I mean, you must have done it to some degree. Yeah.
Have. I mean, the culture shifted, and we have. I mean, not to the extent I wish we have, but yes, that eventually happened on a small scale. Yeah, yeah.
I think Ben's saying people are coming in and wanting to make students coming in and wanting to make a comic just about someone crossing the street. I think that means that it has happened in just in ways that aren't A to B. You know, it's definitely the work that you've both done in different ways has seeped in all these unpredictable ways.
Yeah.
Even as things do go in the other direction in mass culture.
Yeah. Anyway, it's the same, I think,
Very happy.
problem. What we see playing out, you know, with journalists and the general world of publishing and media. And, you know, the big movie writers strike. Is that still going on? I mean,
I think so, yeah.
When are the comic writers going to strike for more money? I think
we'll have people.
Can't.
We'll have people. The rest of the symposium calendar will address.
Yeah.
When
so thanks to everybody for coming.
Yeah, first, thanks to Ben and Gary for spending so much time talking about these things. I think it was really beautiful to hear you guys in conversation. And there'll be more conversation between the two of you. I believe there'll be an issue of the Comics Journal that has an interview between Gary and Ben coming up.
They didn't do it yet, but
hope so.
So we'll hope for that. And thank you guys so much. Thanks to everyone in the audience for participating in this. And next week we will have Margaret Galvan. So if you're interested in that, please check out the symposium schedule and register for that one the same as you did for this. So thank you all, and good night.
Take care. Good night.
Bye, you guys.
Bye, Gary.
See you, Ben.
Bye.